I'm out here at the main nursery just north of Trumansburg, New York, and I thought it'd be interesting to share some notes about hugelmounds or hugelculture and how we've set them up in this landscape and some different strategies and ideas around how you may consider working with them and what to expect when you set a hugelmound in motion. So stick around. So what is a hugelmound in the first place? Well, I'm going to link in the description to some web pages that give much deeper detail about the history of them, how they're used, etc. But the overview is basically permanent raised beds that include woody debris at the core to help absorb nutrients and water during the wetter months and release it to the soil during the drier months. In our 6-acre landscape here, we've got hugelmounds of all sorts of shapes and sizes for different reasons. And so what I thought would be interesting is to show you, you can go online and you can see examples of absolute best practice, digging down into the earth, laying in the exact right type of log, the right type of layers, finishing with compost on top. When you do that, you get pretty good results right out of the gate. But you can also use hugelmounds as a way to manage a wooded or canopied landscape where you can be sketching out future garden beds if you're not in a rush for them to be productive right away. So for example, what you're seeing in here, this has been laid out just this winter, and it's the result of this white pine getting some significant wind damage earlier in the winter. Tons of branches came falling down. We're in the middle of the woods, and so do I want to burn them? No. Maybe I can make a brush wall. Well, that's far away from here. Maybe I want to make charcoal. Well, it's too wet in this area to dig down and do a cone pit. So laying up this pile, knowing that over time it'll break down, that's one way to kind of sketch a hugelmound or a permanent raised bed with woody debris in the interior, so long as I don't expect anything out of this for the first few years. Here's a spot where, in the process of clearing some older Scots pine, you can see some old logs laid out. There's a little bit of a texture here, and branches, woody debris, they're in here. This is a few years old, so they're starting to really break down. But you can see I'm also not focusing on getting it exactly right out of the gate. It's laying some logs here because that they needed to go somewhere. And then in this case, this got a little bit of soil on top because I went through and was doing a little bit of shovel work last year to reveal a ditch to allow water to make a switchback and move through this landscape. So there's another layer of benefit with the hugelmound is, okay, I've got woody debris that's got to go somewhere, and I'm also trying to do some earthworks by hand where I've got shovelfuls of soil that need to go somewhere. That's a perfect marriage of elements in a landscape. The woody debris laying where you want to have production in the future, and the soil you're digging out capping that woody debris. That moves you to production a lot faster. This was a closed canopy of white ash and a few not so healthy white pine last season. I cut them down to get some more light into here. This is a particularly wet area in our woods. It's a bowl shape in the landscape, so it aggregates and collects water. And here is, on the continuum of hugelmound making, the rough sketch idea. Permanent raised beds laid out on contour-ish. We're not in a very steep slope here, so I'm not worried about erosion. I didn't use an A-level to measure this exactly, but laid the beds roughly following the contour of the landscape and laid them out with the most coarse, biggest chunks of wood first. You can see some sticking out here. That's pine of some sort, but there's also some ash logs. The nicest ones we used for posts and for firewood, but then the tops, all of the branches in this case, could have been turned into biochar, but it was just too wet, wasn't the right time of year, so they were laid up, and then you can see where the walkways were dug out and that soil thrown on top. Again, very much rough sketch. I'm showing you not necessarily best practice, but just one way to leverage the concept of hugelmounds, again, if you're not in a rush. It's interesting to see that even year one, or this is the second year that we're going to have here, Last year when we put that soil from the walkways on top of these logs, now mind you, these were freshly cut logs last year. They are not breaking down just yet, but they will ultimately. We threw some seed for purple top turnip. There was some Sudan grass in here. I think a bit of buckwheat. In other words, we sowed the soil to a cover crop, and you can see it worked fine enough. There are turnips in here, breaking up the soil. There's some food if we want to harvest it. And what it does is it gives me some hints as to where the fertility is starting to really unlock. The bigger the turnip, the readier it is for something nice next year. In fact, I'll bring this one inside. We'll cook that up for dinner. That's not bad for a pile of logs and some mucky soil in the woods within a few months of cutting down the trees that were here just last year. Where I think you can get yourself into some trouble or some real serious disappointment is if you were to make hugelmounds in your landscape without following best practices. In other words, you don't dig down first. There's a lot of labor to do them correctly. And Sepp Holzer, who's the fellow who really made them popular, most of the time made them with big machines. And so for us doing it by hand, unless you're doing it properly, it's kind of a bummer what can happen the first year, even the second year. And so what I'd strongly dissuade folks from doing is if it's the first time you're making a hugelmound, don't expect a tree to work or a shrub. Let's say you bought a nice $25 grafted apple and you want to put it in, wait a while. Use the hugelmounds to grow squash and turnips and kale and things like that. See how they do. Once they start taking off, you know you can move up through succession. And so just for some comparison, and so you can get a sense of what to expect if you're in a cool, moist climate like we are, Central New York State, Zone 5B is where this is taking place. This is a hugelmound that was laid up this winter. I have zero expectation of it growing anything. It is basically just a pile of material that'll break down slowly. What does it look like if it's been here for a while? In a way, they almost dissolve into the landscape. You can barely sense that they're there. But if I get down low, you can see the lumpiness. This was otherwise a pretty flat space. And this area, which has all these miscanthus stalks, so the miscanthus is now acting as a very simple fence to deflect deer. In the middle of those sticks of miscanthus are hazelnuts I just planted, and I put cuttings of elderberry and black currants on the edges. And so this is a hugelmound that I feel is now matured enough to be ready to move up succession. And what's interesting, this was probably laid up about 6 or 7 years ago. Here is the same idea of tree trunks laid out. There's no trickery here. I didn't chip this. I didn't run a grinder. I simply cut it down with electric chainsaw or hand tools. Some of this I turned into charcoal. And so now there's char and broken down wood, and now seedling shrubs and trees that are coming in. This is a hugelmound that's starting to evolve and be ready to move up into succession and complexity. And you can see I'm still not concerned with the details. I charred a bunch of wood. Some of them didn't work out. I just threw them on the lump, threw some soil on top as time allowed, but didn't fuss with it. Because I'm doing this practice extensively over the 6 acres, I can always be sketching new hugelmounds, keeping an eye on aging mounds, and deciding if they're really at a stage to be ready to receive nice plants that are productive for us, or if we just let them rest and continue to decompose. It's kind of hard to imagine, but when my folks first invested in this 6-acre property in 2008, so here we are in 2020, so 12 years ago, this area of the woods was where the previous owners had been dumping all of the branches, logs, debris, any prunings of the woods just got piled up in this area. And I went through and stepped them down. I cut them up a little bit with a chainsaw and laid them roughly in this area here and this area over here, and then dug out a little pond and took that soil and threw it on top of those areas. So this was basically all logs and sticks 10, 12 years ago. This is a very old hugelmound and a very large one. It's about 6 feet wide and goes all the way around in this big band. And I'm working on another pond down slope. Let's see what the soil looks like in here. So it's gotten weedy, but that's fine. That's all fertility and growth. We can switch it over to other plants. After 10 or 12 years, and throwing some soil on top, the logs are more or less gone. So we have generally poorly drained, tight, nutrient-lean silt in our landscape. And here, where there's an old hugelmound, I mean old as in a decade old, we basically have worm castings and healthy roots. I can see where there's piles of moss. That's most likely where some old rotten logs and debris are. So that was a Scots pine tree 12 years ago. It's now beautiful. I can squeeze it and the water drips out. That's what we want with these. In a wet, flat landscape, especially with low fertility, building up these mounds and letting them slowly decompose, we've got incredible fertility, good drainage, and proximity to ample water because of what we dug down from. In that little pond, which I've been chipping away at this winter, each shovelful is getting thrown onto these sticks, which are, I would say, 2 or 3 years old. This spring, I'll spread this soil out a little bit, and I'll probably throw some kale seeds. Maybe we'll push a couple winter squash seeds in. We'll see what takes. I'm looking forward to getting some trees in here within, let's say, by the year 2022. As a practice, as a way to manage in this landscape for the last 10, 12 years, you can see hugelmounds are a pretty significant part of the whole layout in here. And by not getting hung up on the details and not needing it to work out very quickly, I can just basically watch for the weeds to grow, look for areas that when I pick at them in the summer when it's dry, they're still moist, and know that I've got some nooks and crannies that are ready to be planted into. Ooh, this one's ready for something this spring. So if you happen to have a landscape that is canopied in trees that maybe aren't as productive or well adapted, maybe there's disease or maybe there's an area near you where you can harvest that sort of material, it's a really great strategy over a long, slow period to build up incredibly fertile, rich, well-drained, and yet water-available beds in your landscape. I love seeing what once was a good sturdy log devolve or evolve, it's hard to say, into building blocks for life. And over again, I see the weeds or the plants that we set in motion absolutely adore running their roots through that decomposing material. That's a sponge that has a tremendous amount of resiliency and backup of water, nutrient, and the like. They're a great design, but really it's about setting them in motion and not expecting the world of them, coming back to them later and then realizing, ooh, these are fun, and they're ready to go. Thanks for watching. Excited to see some roots do the rest of this. That is some richness. Thanks, nature. Thanks, time.